Good evening all, and welcome. Before the video begins, I'd like to share with you something that someone sent to me really recently. It's this cool interactive film. So every episode, the main character Paige has to make a choice, and that's when the audience helps by voting. Each episode is about 10 minutes long, with episodes 1 and 2 currently released. And what happens is when you vote at the end of every week, the next thing happens in the next episode. It's a really cool concept, and if you'd like to check it out, I highly do recommend it. I just thought it could be something fun, an extra you guys might want to do during quarantine. Alright then guys, but for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s. And me and my childhood friend Joe were outside all the time. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning and we'd stay in the woods all weekend. We'd only come out for school. We loved pretending we were frontiersmen. We'd build shelters, traps, practice making fire with sticks, the whole 9 yards. When we got to be in high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we would walk the railroad tracks out in the country, but instead of looking for a body, we'd find cool bridges to fish from, a camp a little ways off the tracks. Of course, we knew this was dangerous, and we'd likely be trespassing, but we were kids. We had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers. We discovered bridges no one went to. We fished. We hid from trains. At night we camped in woods just near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was idyllic. In fact, it was so fun we did it multiple times and never had a problem. After high school, me and Joe went our own ways. We both left home, but always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits so we'd see each other occasionally. Well, one summer in the mid-90s, it worked out we were both in town for about a week or two. We'd do this stuff with family in the day, and at night, we'd either catch drinks at a bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe got talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer are one hell of a mix. Soon we decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp one night and walk home. The day came. We started out early morning. We had my wife drop us off at our old spot where we used to start, right outside our hometown. She thought it was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well. We had a map, so I said, "What the hell?" and we set off. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge, smoked a joint and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we bought some canned food and other stuff. Before night started to set in, we picked a spot to camp. It was a thick forested area, trees on every side of the train tracks, so you felt like you were in a tunnel. We had brought small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting of the perimeter. Now, this is what we used to do in the old days too. We'd walk around a little bit just to make sure some dude's house wasn't just over the hill and we were actually camping in their yard. We walked maybe 100 or so feet into the woods and up a small incline and figured if we didn't see anything from the top of this short hill, we'd be fine. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods. It was barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were, there didn't look to be anyone in it either. All was quiet. No movement could be seen. No lights. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw it wasn't a sugar shack at all. It was in fact an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building whose wooden planks were almost black from years of moss and rot. A cross still stirred atop of the place, also withered black. None of the windows had glass, and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside. There were rows of pews and a built-up section in front for a preacher to stand. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else. No footprints, no paths, no roads. It was simply an abandoned church. We left immediately and went back up the hill to our spot where we had picked a camp. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a little uneasy. We chalked it up to the natural creepiness of seeing a church in the middle of the woods. Besides, at this point it was dusk, and we just decided to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep and move out early next morning. Night set in, and as we lay in our hammocks and got talking, we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went a little bit like this. "Do you hear that? What was that? It sounds like people singing." And it did sound just like singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, and the singing continued, but it wasn't getting louder. Finally, we decided to creep back up the hill and see if we could spy where the sound was coming from. We could still move very quietly in the woods from the old days. It was second nature to us. The moon was barely out, but it provided enough light so that you wouldn't walk right into a tree, but it was nearly pitch black. We didn't use flashlights as we crept slowly up the hill, and we didn't talk. When we got up to the top, we saw light in the distance. It was coming from the church, and the singing was coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a hushed conversation that boiled down to, "Can you believe this?" The light looked to be candlelight from the way it flickered, and though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung. It sounded like church music, but in another language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was in there, but we only saw the occasional shadows. We had no intention of getting closer either. We had about a football field's length between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit, and then it stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice thoroughly scared me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher, the kind you see in movies, but again, it was like he was speaking a different language, as I couldn't understand a single word. Eventually, it got to where the single male voice would say something and then the bunch of voices would answer in song. This lasted for a while, and then they all broke into this long, sustained wail that just kept getting louder. It got so loud and so disturbing that I covered my ears. Then it stopped. At this point, I was just getting ready to say, "Let's get out of here," when Joe puts a hand on my shoulder and hissed, "They're coming out." We were far enough away that we couldn't make them out really well, but what we could see was a line of figures walk out the open doorway, all holding hands in single file. We could see them holding flashlights. They began to sing again, and the light from the flashlights began to move towards us and the hill. We booked it down to our campsite, grabbed our stuff and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks in the direction we had come from, and after a few minutes we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving erratically, like whoever was holding them was shaking them. We continued to run in spurts and walk as fast as we could. We eventually stopped seeing the lights and came by a road. By our small map, we knew that our town was about 15 minutes down the road, and we walked there. We got to the 24-hour gas station and called my wife to come get us. My wife and other friends all just thought it was kids messing with us, but I heard those voices, and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. Not sure who those people were, but it was definitely the creepiest thing that has ever happened to me out in the woods. Some things in life you just wish you could forget ever happened. Like one cold night in England around the time of my 20th birthday. It was September, and I was going through a lot of changes in my life, including a painful breakup. To avoid just moping around my room, I decided to get out for a while, but I didn't want to go to my usual place because it reminded me too much of my ex-girlfriend. So I decided instead to visit the lake my grandfather runs. It's about the same distance, but it felt strange going the opposite direction to what I was used to. Upon entering the lake via the toll gates, my grandfather had provided me with a key to unlock. I became aware that I was completely alone here, which is not something I had counted on. I assumed that there would be fishermen, swimmers, but there wasn't a soul in sight, as this particular night was a Sunday afternoon, and the lake was closed for business. Now, aware that my grandfather had provided me with a key for the gate, and not wanting to return home, I decided to explore the woods on my own. I began my journey through the trees, not wanting to go near the lake as the sky darkened. It began to blacken the water's surface. The sight of that huge lake on the verge of freezing filled me with dread. It was foolish of me to start this late in the day, but waking up so late and not leaving the house had made me completely lose track of how fast it gets dark this time of year. After 15 minutes of walking, I turned right back around and walked the way I came, or at least I thought I did. But over 20 minutes later, as I realized something had gone drastically wrong, as I was looking around for the green gates which I had previously entered, and they were nowhere in sight. Thoughts raced through my mind, like the fact that I might just be spending the night in here. Lost and terrified in the woods, I ran. My heart pounded, and the sky became alarmingly dark. My family were going to wonder why I wasn't home. It was all too much, and I was forced to do the one thing I didn't want to do in the world: sit on a dead tree log in the middle of this dark and unfamiliar forest. I waited there and composed myself. It became clear to me that my best chance was to find the path, so I began to set off in a random direction, when all of a sudden I heard the unmistakable sound of twigs snapping behind me. I whipped back, and what I saw without a doubt was the most horrific sight I've ever laid eyes on. Where I had been just moments before sat a man. His rigid arms stuck out shockingly to the sides. It was impossible to tell whether he was clothed or not, as his entire body was caked in a thick white powder. His hair was also indistinguishable from the chalky coating. The only things visible were his eyes, which were wide open and bulging, and his mouth, which gaped open in a sickening manner. We stayed this way, perfectly still, until the scene was shattered by the man letting out a horrendous, hacking cough. Plumes of white dust exhumed from his mouth. Something inside me screamed to get the hell out of there, so I turned and ran as fast as my legs could carry me, away from that horrific coughing sound. I didn't even look back, quickly finding the path and then almost immediately after the gates, which despite being tall, I climbed over instead of trying to unlock the lock. When I got home, I explained what I saw to my parents and eventually calmed down. My mother tells me that the lake, like a lot of lakes, was originally used as a quarry, and in fact, miners could have been crushed to death in cave-ins mining chalk in the dangerous conditions of the mine. Although that was years ago now, I still have never been so scared, and I will still never go back there for as long as I live. The scariest night of my entire life was a close encounter with a later confirmed murderer when I was camping with my boyfriend in the mountains. It ended with us running for our lives down the mountain in the pitch black, clutching weapons and a hammer for self-protection. It was the end of 2018, our first getaway together as a couple. We went to the Appalachian Trail in Virginia. We were naive. We thought it would be more romantic to camp out as far off the beaten track as possible. We walked really far into the wilderness and got to a spot where nobody passed us all afternoon. We were making s'mores over the campfire after it had just gotten dark, as it was twilight. All of a sudden, my boyfriend, who has 20/20 vision, saw a man approach us slowly. He was creeping up on us. At first, he thought it was a park ranger coming to tell us to put our campfire out. I began to hide the weed, thinking this was our biggest concern. So my boyfriend called out to him, "Hey, can I help you?" We thought it was weird he didn't have any kind of light on him. He didn't have any camping bag, nothing for camping. Why was he out here so far with no camping gear at night and no light? He sped up after my boyfriend called out and came right at him. He had this strange look in his eyes. The look was absent, blank and weird. He didn't answer and just kept walking right at him. When my boyfriend realized it wasn't a park ranger, he quickly put his hand in his pocket where he had a concealed weapon. He made it very clear that he had a weapon, and it was only after my boyfriend did that this guy acknowledged us. He said, "Oh, I was just wondering if y'all having a party." Remember, we're miles away from a single soul, and it was beginning to get dark when he began to approach us slowly without a flashlight. He had no camping gear with him, just a tiny drawstring bag on his back. After he asked us what we were doing, we didn't give him any answers, but asked him what he was doing. He didn't answer. He just looked past my boyfriend towards the site. It was windy, so we had to put up a tarp to shield ourselves. This also meant the guy approaching couldn't see how many people were at our site. "How many people you got with you?" He began to circle our site to check us out. He asked again if we had any other people with us, and my boyfriend didn't answer, and he carried on circling around our camp. Bear in mind, we had set up our camp on this crazy steep hill. It was the only spot for miles that was possible to put up a camp. However, he told us that he was going to set up a camp nearby. He proceeds to walk off in a direction straight up the hill. We knew for a fact he couldn't put a camp on there because of the terrain. Remember, he had no light with him, no camping gear, no anything. We were silent. We listened to his footsteps on the leaves as he walked up the hill in his direction, completely off the path. He walked for about 30 seconds, and then his footsteps stopped completely. He was just still, silent. We knew he was still there, but we couldn't see him. It was dark. At this point, I was freaking out. I didn't want to seem like a coward in front of my boyfriend. We had been talking about whether we needed to leave. My boyfriend handed me the utensil and said if anything happens, I should run. At this point, I knew it wasn't just me freaking out unnecessarily. He said we needed to get out of there and to just grab essential items. I was scared that this creep had plans for us with a firearm of his own. Later on, I said to my boyfriend that this is probably the type of guy that would prefer to end people's lives with a sharp object. We began to walk down the trail, running in the pitch darkness with our flashlights off, for at least a mile. My boyfriend looked back to see him staring at one point. He ran behind me to protect me. This experience stuck with me. I still can't think of a rational or non-menacing reason as to why that guy was there that night. I've tried. Now this was at the end of 2018, but my boyfriend, now husband, and I were remembering it last night. I decided to type into Google to see if there had been anything strange happen in the same place around the same time. And there was. A few months after our incident on the same trail, an unhinged man with crazy eyes approached some hikers at twilight as it was getting dark. He behaved in a deranged and aggressive manner before stabbing a man till his end with a 17-inch weapon. A woman he was with ran for her life down the trail. Finally, she raised her hands in surrender, and he began to hurt her as well. And somehow she managed to get away. That guy carried on wandering the trails and shouted out to other campers to give him a flashlight. They didn't, thank goodness. All of these details are the same guy who approached us. Same age, same deranged eyes, and same lack of a flashlight. The more articles I read, the more I realized this psycho had been roaming the hiking trails harassing hikers for a while. A few different people had reported him, not just us. Apparently this erratic and violent guy was well known to law enforcement along the Appalachian Trail. His name is James Sovereign Jordan. We got lucky. It could have been us. This encounter happened years ago. I grew up in a tiny French village in mid-northern France, in an area that is mostly well known for its massive forest. My little village was in the middle of this forest, surrounded by trees from all sides. Most of its secluded population was of an elderly demographic. The forest was large enough that if you walked in one direction, it would be hours or even days if you chose a bad trajectory, until you'd find any other proper civilization, aside from the occasional lone road. Now, don't get me wrong, the forest is lovely and I've spent many cherished memories there, but it's also rather secluded, and I can only begin to imagine what mysterious things happen under the cover of so many dense twigs, branches, and leaves. Every day to get to school, my mum would drive me and my sister to school in the next town over. However, on this fateful morning, we had to stop the car mere seconds after driving off. In the middle of this rather narrow and seldom used road, there was an elderly woman in her nightgown, splattered with mud and bruises and seemingly exhausted beyond her wits. She was barefoot, her feet blackened by mud and caked with lashes of blood. She didn't flinch as the car crawled towards her, nor did she show any signs of relief as my mum stepped out of the car to greet her. She was terribly confused and didn't seem entirely sure what to say or how to begin. For a moment, she just babbled incomprehensibly. But within a few seconds, a somewhat coherent sentence started to form. She was repeating that she'd ran all night, as it was roughly 7:30 in the morning in early spring, so the sun had just begun to rise not too long ago. She said she'd run through the forest not knowing where to go, but as she went on it became clear that she had been trying to escape something. She paused, catching her breath, and gathered her thoughts. It was clear that this was all a mess in her mind, and just now was she trying to collect everything coherently. Someone, she continued, had kept her locked up in a cellar. She didn't know where or how long, or who it was, simply that they had locked her up. It was damp and muddy, she said. She didn't remember how she got out. All she knew is that it was in the dead of the forest in the dead of night, so she ran as fast as her frail body would allow. At this point, it seems like she had nothing more to say, for it seemed like her nighttime escape had culminated in us meeting her. I don't exactly remember what she and my mum discussed next, but it resulted in my mother calling the old lady's son who lived on the other side of the village. A few minutes later, he arrived and told us we should leave. Fast forward a few days. I asked my mum if she knew what became of the old lady after we left her. I'm not sure how my mum found out this next bit, but apparently a few men had broken into her house that night, beaten her up, ransacked her home, stealing some of her most expensive possessions, and she had apparently fled for cover into the forest, which was only a few meters away from her house. Now, if that isn't creepy enough, a few extra details stick out in my mind. First, when we found her in the middle of that narrow road, it turns out she was standing right next to her house. Perhaps the burglars were still in her home as we spoke to her. Her sense of time did seem distorted, after all. Secondly, no mention of the supposed cellar she was being made to keep inside of. Had it been a fiction of her panic and delusion? Or had she really been locked up somewhere in the forest, only for no one to believe her? It seems unlikely, but you do occasionally stumble on old and grotty stone huts and ruins in the forest. Perhaps one of them had a few gruesome tales to share. Unfortunately, we never spoke to that family again, so we never did find out what really happened that night. I believe the elderly lady has now passed on. We will never fully find out the truth about that cellar, but nonetheless, whenever I return home and drive past that house on the narrow street, I can't help but remember the frail lady standing alone in her muddy nightgown. I grew up and lived in rural New England most of my life, which meant that when I was in high school, if my friends and I wanted to go see a movie, we had to drive about 45 minutes. Well, one night my buddy and I decided to go see a movie, some action flick like Judge Dredd or Captain America. And on the way back home I decided to take the back roads so that I could drive a little faster. Now, back roads in Vermont are a lot of fun and scary as hell if you don't know what you're doing. They're almost like one-lane dirt roads, cutting through miles of endless mountain and forest with a house about every 5 miles or so if you're lucky. So we're on one of these roads, the radio is playing some rock and roll and it's snowing. Not lightly snowing or crazy amounts of snowing, just a soft, pleasant snowfall. And we're about halfway home, deep in the woods, and we come to this hill, and at the top of the hill it curves, so it's a blind hill in the middle of the woods. And it's snowing. So I slowed down significantly. We round the corner, and my headlights lit up this spot on the side of the road, where the snow wasn't falling, more like hovering in midair. There was also a person standing there, and the snow was building up on their shoulders and head, and it stayed that way long enough for me to register everything that was going on. And then the snow build-up all sort of collapses, and it looked like everything else that I had just driven past. Well, I continued driving for a while in silence, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen, to see if I can find a rational explanation. I then turned to my friend. "Did you see that?" "Oh, thank God. I thought I was hallucinating," he replied. So we described what we saw, and we saw the same thing. And then we turned around and drove back up and down the road really slowly to see if we could see it again, or find a reason as to why that might have happened, and there was nothing. I used to live in a fairly populated condo complex, and my condo's backyard goes on for about 10 feet, then it's a large wooded hill/plateau. We get a lot of snow where we live, and therefore most of the trees are very hardy pine or oak trees that can take lots of water, but can also last without it for a while when it gets cold. Now that you have the context, allow me to share the story. It was late spring a few years back, and I went to explore in the woods as I usually do. It was a little muddy at the base of the hill, and the trees had grown leaves that were green and healthy. No signs of invasive bugs or animals to be seen, and it was obviously freshly rained. About 2 or 3 nights later, I woke to the sound of a loud cracking and snapping, which was horrifying on its own. Weird stuff had happened in that house. I went out the next day, and I was really confused, because all of the otherwise healthy trees were dried out, and a lot of them were snapped halfway up the trunk. Once again, these trees were girthy, but there was no signs of parasites. If you could try and help me figure this out, all answers are welcome. I honestly have no idea how otherwise healthy trees could have been torn in half and dried out a few days later. A number of years back, me and my girlfriend decided to go camping in the nearby woods. These woods are fairly large, and we had made it our habit every weekend to go out and explore for our exercise. But on this occasion, we opted to stay out a little bit until after dark. So we packed our gear in the morning and made a fun hike to a local creek in the middle of these woods. It was very remote and we were the only people there. I wasn't sure about camping laws, but my girlfriend said we'd be fine, so we set up our tent and tried to settle in for the evening. We'd brought a portable power bank, and fortunately there was still signal in the area, as I had a lot of scrolling to do through all my social media apps. It was getting late, around 10 p.m. The sun had already set, and I was just waiting to go to bed in our little sleeping bag. As we snuggle in and turn off our little lamp, I'm finding it very hard to sleep on the admittedly quite uncomfortable floor. My girlfriend has no trouble sleeping, and when she's out, she's like a rock. I lie there tossing and turning, trying not to disturb her, and after a while I get hot and frustrated, unzip myself, and walk outside in the dark, thinking that I just need to calm down and cool off before I can get to sleep. But that's when I hear something strange. I hear what sounds like children's laughter in the faraway distance. I look around and I see nothing. It's pitch black. There can't be any children here, I think to myself. So I peer my eyes even further into the darkness to see if I can spot any lights far away that would account for this creepy noise. There's nothing. Now feeling more anxious and awake than before, I resolve to not go back in, but to have a poke around and see where this sound is coming from. Aside from being creepy, isn't it very unsafe for young kids to be playing in the dark at night in the middle of the woods? Of course it is. So I make my way over to where the sound is coming from. But the closer I think I get, the further away it still remains. After a while, there is complete silence, and I stop dead in my tracks. Something told me not to move. It was quite dark this night. Had I moved another few steps or so, I would have fallen down a hole that I had previously not seen. It was like a ditch where trees didn't grow. It was strange, perhaps an ancient riverbed. Nonetheless, had the voices in the woods guided me to this spot, attempting to push my fate, attempting to make me fall? I don't think I'll ever know for sure. All that I do know is that I made it back to the tent, didn't sleep a wink, and in the morning convinced my girlfriend to take us home. I never explained why, but she understood from my look that it terrified me to my core. Some things are best left unsaid. When I was young, my parents told me not to go into the woods behind my house, that they were dangerous, that there were wild animals that could hurt me, and to always stay within the garden. There was a small fence that kept our property separate from the woods, and I, for the most part, did what I was told. But being a curious 7-year-old, one day curiosity got the better of me. I remember my father was cooking in the kitchen, and my mother must have been doing something upstairs, I don't remember what, and curiosity got the better of me. I opened up the fence and made my way across just to have a peek into the woods. I told myself I wouldn't take long and that I'd be back in a jiffy before my parents noticed. The woods were quite cool. From my bedroom I could see fairly far into them, but there were parts that I'd never seen before. The further I got, the more interested I became. I was getting very curious, and I saw something shiny on the floor ahead of me. I went to collect it and found a coin. I think it must have been a dime, and I was very pleased as a 7-year-old to have such a large amount of currency. In my young brain, I told myself there must be more money scattered about, so I kept on looking, and that is where my downfall happened. While I was looking around, I failed to realize a tree root conveniently popping out of the ground. I tripped over it and tumbled deep into a ditch. I must have been at least 5 feet deep, and I was tangled between leaves and rocks. My arm hurt like hell, and I started to scream. I tried to move, but my arm was in so much pain. I can't even begin to describe how hurt I was. I managed to somehow stumble to my feet, and that's when I realized that without 2 functioning arms, there was no way I was going to get out of this hole. It was very deep, and I was screwed. I started screaming out for what felt like hours. Finally, just before dark, do I hear my parents calling my name. I shout at them that I was here, and my parents, instead of scolding me for going into the woods, just picked me up out of the hole. My dad had to jump in first, and took me to the nearest hospital. Turns out I'd fractured my arm in a couple of different places. I'd also hurt my back significantly, which is something I didn't notice, and had an assortment of small cuts and bruises on many other places across my body. The doctors said that they were very lucky to have found me when they did, as staying there overnight could have rapidly deteriorated my condition. In any case, I realized that maybe I shouldn't have gone out exploring in the woods, and I didn't go out there again until I was about 15, angsty, and needed a place to vent. But I never went as far as I did that first time. Please keep an eye on your kids, people. My life could have ended up a whole lot different if my parents hadn't have found me. I live in Victoria, Australia, and we don't get much snow unless you venture up into the mountain area where the climate is significantly colder. As expected, I very rarely see snow in person, so during my childhood, my mum and I would visit my papa up in Glenorchy, Victoria at least once a year. He would drive us up to a nearby mountain where we would indulge in what little snow we could play in. It was never particularly much, but we loved it. I have a distinct memory of the nausea from the bending roads and my ears getting blocked from ascending so fast. And I'll never forget the fear that our car would swerve off the narrow road and fall off the cliff. Ah, good times. It was one of these trips that my mum and I went on a small hike through a thriving forest up in the mountains. Unfortunately, I don't remember the name of the location, as I was around 8 to 11 years old at the time. There wasn't much snow as usual, just patches, but it was beautiful, and there was no one else in sight. I can't recall why it was just the 2 of us at that moment. My papa did have a short-term camper at the time, so possibly my mum just wanted a break from him. I remember feeling so content with our lives at that moment. Then this feeling washed over us, a feeling of impending doom and danger. It was a sinking feeling in my chest. I remember asking my mum something like, "Do you feel that?" as we stood there bewildered. We felt like we didn't belong here, that we should leave immediately. Now, might I add that this was during the day, not at night. I had been in Scouts most of my childhood and was very familiar with this type of environment. Yet here we were, frantically looking around for the source of this dread we were feeling deep in our gut. It felt like we were being watched, like 1,000 judgmental eyes were gazing upon us. It was so intimidating. I remember my heart beating rapidly and my body shaking as we quickly paced back to Papa's car. There was no sound of sticks breaking, no ominous figures within the trees, and no growling of monsters. This was just a feeling. I asked my mum to describe her side of the story, and she remembers an image in her head of a large creature crawling up the mountain to get us. She felt as if this was in the wind. Every big gust it would come closer and closer. There was a nagging voice in her telling her to leave and get out, over and over, and getting louder the longer we were there. It was a bit dramatic, but still an interesting interpretation of the same event. Fortunately, nothing else happened that day. We made it back to the car safely and carried on with our trip. Who knows? I thought I was the only one who remembered this experience, and I just assumed it was all in my head. After all, I'm a very anxious child, and my mind could have exaggerated it. However, it was only a couple of years ago that my mum mentioned it, and I realized it did really happen. It makes me so happy, because I crave these paranormal and unexplained experiences in my life, yet I've had very little luck. Maybe it's my skeptical nature that hindered me from accepting that our world is a lot more supernatural than we perceive it. I was walking my boyfriend's dog a month or so ago on some trails near the beach. His dogs are both mutts, one husky chow, another a pit bull hippo. They're both loving, sweet, social, and completely chill. This particular trail leads down to an estuary and starts in a state park, but there are only 2 parking spots at the trailhead, so it's nearly always deserted when I'm there. There is basically a maintained trail that goes to the estuary, and then there is an unofficial trail that loops off the estuary trail. It's hard to spot and is largely overgrown, but I can tell I'm not the only one who uses it. I was walking the dogs on the main trail, and just getting to the estuary where we typically stop and watch birds for a bit, when one of the dogs, the husky, starts this low growl and puffed a full mohawk. We live in an area with bears and cougars, so that's the first place my mind went. I drew my pistol just in case and started backing up the trail. I'd only taken a few steps dragging the husky away, as the pit bull was still clueless and watching a squirrel, when a creepy guy stepped out from behind a tree. He wasn't scary looking. He just looked like your typical outdoorsy type guy that frequented the craft breweries on every corner of Washington. He was maybe late 40s, early 50s. The tree behind him wasn't huge. He would have had to position himself deliberately to hide behind it when I was approaching. He started walking towards me, smiling and growling, pissed off dog like it was a bunny rabbit talking to him, in a soothing voice with his hand out like he was going to pet it. The dog barked loudly and continued to growl in an unfamiliar and terrifying way. At this moment, my pit finally got her act together and looked away from her new squirrel friend. She took in the scene and got between the guy and me immediately. She didn't puff or growl, as honestly I wasn't sure what she was going to do, but her tail was out at a weird angle, and she bared her teeth at him. Now, I don't know if it was her threatening looks, or if the creep had caught a glimpse of my firearm that I was holding down by my side, but he suddenly dropped the amicable hiker facade and gave me this look that made my skin crawl. It was pure malice. He didn't move a step after that, and didn't say anything else. It was creepy as hell. I said something along the lines of, "Don't you come near me," and we left quickly. This time I made sure he saw my weapon as I turned around. When I got to the part of the trail that loops off, I took it after checking to see if he was still in sight. The dogs were super tense and on alert, and I eventually slowed down so that I could listen, and also because I'm quite large and was about to pass out from exhaustion. The loop meanders wide around the trail and is probably a quarter of a mile or so longer than the main path, which itself is maybe a mile. When I was nearing the point that the loop hit the main trail again, my good boy began to growl once more. It was super low, so thankfully the creeper didn't hear it. He was on the main trail heading back towards the estuary. As soon as he was out of sight, we booked it the last 100 yards or so off the trail to the trailhead. The Subaru I had parked next to it had its hatch open. It hadn't been open when I'd gotten there. I tried to see the license plate, but couldn't since it was on the hatch, and I wasn't willing to take a second to pull it down to look. I basically threw my pit into the back of my Jeep. She's 90 pounds with the physique of a small hippo, as previously noted, and I'm pretty proud of that, and my other dog hopped up with her. I jumped in and took off, and right as I turned onto the road, my pit barked. That was the first and only time in my 6 months of knowing her that she's ever barked. My best guess of what happened is that as soon as I was out of sight, he started to follow me and didn't know about the other trail. He got to the trailhead ahead of me since this trail was shorter and saw my Jeep was still there, so he opened his hatch for reasons that can't have been good and headed back down the path to find me. When he heard my car door close, he raced back to the trailhead, where my very, very good girl told him what she thought of him. I swear that bark sounded like the combination of all the dirtiest words I know. It was off-season, so the state park was barely manned at all by rangers. As soon as I got back on the road where there was cell signal, I called my brother, who's a cop in the town the park borders. He wasn't on shift and it took a while for anyone to get out there. So creepy guy in the woods, let's not meet again. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed tonight's stories. Certainly some spooky tales from the woods indeed. I actually had a story that was okay, but I didn't think quite made the cut because this video had some really good ones in it. So I ended up having to cut it out. It just wasn't on the same level as scary, so I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna leave it. I really hope you did like it though. Wood stories are some of my favorite. Perhaps we'll have cryptids tomorrow. Maybe I'll even put up a poll so you can decide which cryptid you want to hear. If you like the video, please don't forget to let me know, and obviously a huge thank you as always to my lovely and amazing patrons for their continued support. It really does mean a lot. If you are interested in becoming a patron, signing up for a small amount every month to help keep the channel running, it would mean a lot. And you get some cool perks for signing up too. There's actually a video at the end of the sign up process that explains all the rewards more thoroughly if you're interested. And yesterday I put up a new post, an exclusive post for all current patrons and for anyone who wants to sign up. There's some exclusive stuff there for you to listen to. Alright then guys, but for now it's time for me to sign off. Stay awesome and I'll see you in the next one.